Chainsaw Man is an inverted version of the Rouge Test for self-awareness. It's tough to concentrate on bettering yourself when you've really got to pee. Sigmund Freud gets a bad rap these days just because everything he ever said was wrong. Chainsaw Man is known for its intense and gory action scenes, characters who are driven solely by sex and greed, and for a really unfortunate first kiss. But it's also a surprisingly good representation of several psychological theories. In this video, I'll show you how Chainsaw Man demonstrates 3 of the more well-known psychological theories and show you how those theories help explain the show. Let's check it out. This first one's a bit of a stretch, but it made me laugh when I thought of it, so it gets in. Chainsaw Man is an inverted version of the Rouge Test for self-awareness. It's used mainly to research self-awareness among different animal species and in human children at different stages of development. There are different variations, but the basic idea is that you put a red dot on the child or animal's forehead while it's sleeping or sedated. When it wakes up, you show them a mirror and observe their behavior. If they try to investigate the dot or wipe it off, that means they recognize their reflected image as their own self, and therefore they have an internal concept of who they are and recognize that they are separate from the rest of the physical world. Chainsaw Man switches things up by taking that red dot and putting it, well, everywhere. With the traditional Rouge test, you're supposed to recognize one red dot out of a sea of sensory information. But in Chainsaw Man, everything is red, and Denji's task is to distinguish himself from the solid wall of demon gore that fills his vision and surrounds his physical space. By the end of the first episode, Denji's violent rampage has painted the walls with the blood and entrails of a host of demons, and it seems hard to tell where the effects of his violence end and the still-breathing human begins. But in the middle of that sea of gore, Denji is finally forming a conscious self-identity for the first time. At the beginning of the show, he is driven about by the uncaring people around him and by his impoverished surroundings, responding to his circumstances almost like an inanimate object, obeying the laws of cause and effect. But as the show progresses, Denji no longer merely reacts to his environment. Instead, he can conceive of himself as an individual being who has wants, needs, and goals. And while a lot of people get turned off by the juvenile nature of those goals, I mean, his ultimate dream is to grab a boob, at least he's refreshingly honest about those goals. That might not make him likable, but it can at least make him relatable for a lot of people. This next theory is one that Chainsaw Man demonstrates perfectly: Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Psychology is about explaining and sometimes even predicting human behavior, and Maslow's hierarchy of needs is a system for explaining human motivation. Abraham Maslow divided the concepts that motivate human behavior into different categories of needs. Because Maslow's system is a hierarchy, your more basic physical needs must first be met before you're likely to pursue higher order needs like love or self-fulfillment. In other words, if you're drowning, you're probably not going to be craving a cheeseburger or pondering what you like or dislike about Cubist art. You have to take care of the most pressing need first before you pursue something that might be more abstract or unrelated to your immediate well-being. The plot of the beginning episodes of Chainsaw Man are almost an exact timeline of someone progressing through Maslow's hierarchy. Because Denji struggles to satisfy the basic physiological needs that will keep him alive, like obtaining food, water, and shelter, he continually throws himself into dangerous situations. Those physiological needs are on a more basic level of Maslow's hierarchy, so they take precedence over the next level, which is securing personal safety. If someone was dying of thirst, for example, they might crawl over a field of landmines if there was water on the other side, and Denji literally sacrifices parts of his own body to get the money that he needs for food and to pay his debts. Usually you'll see Maslow's hierarchy represented as a pyramid, even though he never actually set it up in that shape. At the bottom of the pyramid are physiological needs that keep you alive, things like air, food, and water, but also needs that your body can scream at you, like if you have to urinate or take a dump. It's tough to concentrate on bettering yourself when you've really got to pee. These needs tend to start inward and progress outward. First, I have to secure my survival. Then I have to reduce any threat to my immediate self, such as secure my safety, eliminate the threat of abuse, obtain some form of financial security, or other ways to provide for physical needs. And then I can start to reach outward and look for things like love, friendship, or belonging to a family or other important social group. I would argue that Chainsaw Man never really progresses beyond that esteem level of the hierarchy, where you look for the respect of someone that you admire, but it gives some great examples of what it looks like to lack and then fulfill some of those lower levels of need. Think of when Denji is finally safe in episode 1. After he meets Makima, she not only feeds him breakfast, but she gives him a secure way to get food in the future. As soon as Denji is in a safe environment and has his physical needs met, he immediately starts climbing to the next level, where people look for love, acceptance, and intimacy. For Denji, this means an infatuation with Makima. Some people think Denji is a frustrating character because he almost never rises above that level of sexual desire and seems to ignore all the other ways that he could become a more interesting character or grow as a person. But keep in mind that as a general rule, people will not strive for any of the higher motivations in Maslow's system until their more basic motivations are met. And you could argue that Denji is stuck in Maslow's third tier because he's not yet fulfilled it. There are a few clues though that Denji is aware of higher motivations and might one day seek them out. In episode 1, for example, he realizes that he wasn't quite satisfied with just being happy with Pochita, and that he dreamed for something more, though he had a hard time thinking of what that might be. In episode 2, he also feels that something's missing, even though he's living what he considers to be a perfect life. He eventually decides that what is missing is to feel a girl's boobs, but when he finally does, he seems somewhat underwhelmed. Will that sense of unfulfillment keep chasing him up Maslow's hierarchy once he reaches his other goals? Maybe? Let's talk about Freud. Sigmund Freud gets a bad rap these days just because everything he ever said was wrong, but that doesn't mean his ideas can't be useful or interesting. You've probably heard of Freud's divisions of the mind, id, ego, and superego. The id is our more primitive side that contains basic instincts like lust, desire for power, and physical appetites. The id is powerful, chaotic, and has no filter. It tells us to eat everything, kill everything, and sleep with everything all the time. In other words, it's power and Denji. The ego is our conscious awareness of self and our ability to reason. Sometimes people mistake the ego as our good side and the id as our evil side, but that's not quite right. The ego perceives the division between the self and the world and guides us to act in ways that will help us fulfill the desires of the id while protecting us from doing anything that would cause the outside world to want to eliminate us or lock us in jail. Makima might be a good example of this. The superego is the part of the mind that is shaped by the society around it. You can think of the superego as your conscience, that part of you that tries to be good and follow the rules that society has developed. It tries to keep the more destructive impulses of the id in check and tries to turn the ego towards more altruistic or socially beneficial goals. Hayakawa is a good example of the superego. Of course, if you look too deeply at those symbols, they start to break down. Denji and Power might seem to be good examples of the id, but they're both also able to show restraint so that the society around them does not crush them like bugs, which is what the ego does. I mean, if even Power can show a bit of compassion towards a being other than herself, then anyone can. Hayakawa is clearly the superego, but he acts in his own interests and has his own desires. He's not just a stand-in for the rule of law. Some of Makima's handling of Denji feels like the ego reining in the id, but her character is also more complex than that, and she often acts as a representation of society's authority and order, like a superego. In other words, the characters in Chainsaw Man aren't meant to be mapped one-to-one to a simple definition from an Intro to Psychology textbook. Each of the characters are capable of a range of actions, even if their personalities make them lean heavily in one direction almost all the time. Having said all that, I do think that one-to-one Freudian symbolism can be an interesting way to interpret the show if we map the ego onto a character who hasn't been brought up yet. Pochita. In the first episode, Denji and Pochita are literally fused together to save Denji's life. If Pochita represents the ego, then we have the id and ego fusing together to form a new being who for the first time in his life is able to rise above the day-to-day concerns of survival. He's no longer a beast who stumbles from moment to moment at the whims of his environment. He's a man. Well, he's 16, but close enough. The battle within him between the id and the ego erupts to create a being that is immensely powerful, but also full of rage and confusion. We need a maturely developed superego to rein in that power and guide us through that confusion, otherwise we'll become slaves to our competing desires. Freud might say it is this conflict that is the essence of our humanity, the source of our power and the source of our chaos. So yeah, the main draw in Chainsaw Man is the action, and most people aren't going to sit there and psychoanalyze the thing. But it's interesting to me that a hyperviolent anime about a guy with a chainsaw for a head and some of our best psychologists over the years have come to some of the same conclusions about human behavior. And I was surprised at how well some of those psych theories fit the show when I looked into it a little further. Hopefully you found that interesting too. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.